I was getting hot. My kids always complain because it's really cold in my classroom, but part of that's because I've got 28 kids in about, I don't know, a room that's probably probably a fifth of the size of this auditorium. 28 kids in one room with me, that's kind of it gets hot really quickly, so I typically keep it cold for that reason, because it can warm up pretty quickly. All right, so again, we are picking up in 2 Samuel chapter 22. Remember that this is the final section in this book, and in this section, it does not come chronologically. This song that we are in the middle of looking at sort of points to the fact that it was written probably towards the earlier portion of David's reign, as we noted in verse 1. But we sort of entitled this song a song of victory, at least for David. And for David, this song is obviously written as the result of him being able to overcome his foes, and as verse 1 indicated to us, his primary foe, that he, at least the primary thought was the wickedness and the attempts that Saul had to try to kill David. And so now we are sort of in the middle of looking at this song, and David's going to continue along with a lot of the same themes that we noted earlier in this chapter, right? And we pointed out some things that are characteristic of this song. One, that David recognized that when he did get into trouble, there was only one source, or at least one individual that he felt comfortable enough to turning to with all his problems, and that, of course, was God. We saw that in sort of the first section. Of course, David listed a lot of the different trials that he faced, and he uses, again, a lot of imagery to do that, uses pictures of nature to do that. But again, the imagery that's portrayed in verses 5 through 13, or at least verses 5 and 6 and 7 in particular, the imagery and the nature that's portrayed there has nothing to compare with the power of God. And we had a depiction there of God, again, with the picture of nature sort of in the background of it, coming to deliver David from David's foes. And we talked about that another theme that David pointed out, and this was the last part, verses 21 through 30, was the simple fact that God was doing all of this for David because God was rewarding David for his righteousness. And that again points to the fact that people that do good for God, people that are obedient to God, don't always have it easy in this life, but at the end of the day, God will be on their side and deliver them. Now, of course, when we're thinking about this, David's primarily talking about all of this in a physical sense, right? Being delivered from his physical enemies to be placed where he is at this point in his life. We have to keep in mind that in a lot of ways, what David is talking about here, we need to think about it not from a physical sense, but we need to think about it from a spiritual sense. You know, because at some point, we're all, no matter how obedient we are, we're all going to have certain types of physical problems. People are going to give us trouble. Obviously, we all are going to die at some point. So, you know, physically, we can't look at this song of David and say, well, no matter what physical obstacle I face in my life, God is going to help me overcome that. Because some things we may not, right? Certain sicknesses, again, you think about cancer and things like that. Some people are not going to be able to overcome those problems, right? That will lead to that leads to a lot of people dying and certain tragedies that happen, right? Those are physical obstacles. A car wreck, I don't know, any type of physical tragedy that results in death. Those are physical obstacles that people cannot overcome. But we have to keep in mind, as we're thinking about this for us, we're thinking about this spiritually, right? We're not thinking about this from the perspective of no matter what happens to us in life physically, we're going to overcome it. We need to be thinking about this spiritually. If we are spiritually faithful to God, God will reward us spiritually for that with a home in heaven, as again, Wayne's been talking about on Wednesday nights in the book of Revelation that we're going to see in really the final 2 chapters. The reward for those that are spiritually righteous. Well, for David, at least physically, he did prosper because of his righteousness. Spiritually, we prosper because of our willingness to do what God says. And again, that's why God sided with David, because of David's obedience. That's why God will side for us. As we mentioned, Jesus said in Matthew 10, look, if you confess me before men, I'm going to confess you before my Father. If you've got my back in this life, I've got your back in the next life spiritually. And so we are rewarded for righteousness. But now the opposite of that was obviously true too. David pointed out that God's eyes are on the haughty or the prideful, that you may bring them down. If you don't do what God says, you may prosper in this life, or at least in David's life, they didn't prosper. Sometimes the prideful prosper in this life, but spiritually, in eternity, that's not going to work. And that's, again, what we need to think about, the spiritual implication of what David is saying here. So again, David's continuing this same idea. Notice beginning in verse 31 that David says, as for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is proven. He is a shield to all who trust in him. We certainly think about the spiritual implication of what David is saying here, that God, verse 31, that his way is perfect. And for David, it certainly was the case. Doing things God's way and relying on God's help put David in the position where he's at writing this song, where he is now king of Israel, because God removed the obstacles in his way. In a spiritual sense, again, David would, in other psalms, reiterate to the importance of how important God was spiritually, at least how important it was to follow God's plan and how that impacted David spiritually. Think about Psalm 119. David said, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. That certainly carries the idea of spiritual importance. Led David along the right path. As we saw back in chapter 21, not only did David's righteousness in following God's way, it was perfect not just for David, but also for the people of Israel. As they acknowledged, David, if you die, the light that you reflect of God, the lamp of Israel, will be removed. We can't have that happen. So his way is perfect. Certainly we know as Christians, as Jesus said in John 14, the disciples there were questioning about how in the world are we going to get to the place where you're preparing a mansion for us. Well, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. In other words, if you want to get there, you're only going to get there by doing what I say. Because for us as Christians, God's way is perfect, obviously through his Son, Jesus. The word of the Lord is proven. Certainly, you think about this from David's perspective. Again, the idea of something that is proven, it's something that you can rely on. It's something that's dependable. David had seen multiple times in his life where God had delivered him. He knew that God's promises, and certainly that promise of being placed as the king of Israel, David had confidence that that would come true. We as Christians have to keep in mind that the word of the Lord is also proven. Again, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, nobody in here and nobody there in the church of Corinth could personally say, this is what it's like when you die, right? This is what it's like, this is where you're going after you die, because I have personally witnessed it. Nobody could say that, but at the same time, Paul could tell the church in Corinth, look, we walk by faith, not by sight. And the point is we walk by faith in what God has said will happen because his word is proven. For us as Christians, if we're thinking about that from an eternal perspective, I don't have to wonder what's going to happen to me, whether or not heaven or hell is real. I don't have to wonder where I'm going after this life, because if I trust that those things exist because God's word said that heaven and hell exist, if I trust in the fact that if I do what God says based on his word that I will go to heaven, I don't have to wonder about what will happen after I die because I know that His word is proven. It is dependable. His promises do not fall. He is a shield to all who trust in Him. Again, the idea there of being protection. Remember that when we talked about the armor of God, one of the pieces of the armor in Ephesians chapter 6 was a shield, right? And the shield itself being the shield that can quench the fiery darts of the wicked. And so spiritually, His way is perfect. The word of the Lord is proven. He is a shield to all who trust in Him. For who is our God, or for who is God except the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? God is my strength and power, and He makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of deer, and He sets me on my high places. He teaches my hands to make war, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. The statement there in verse 32, for who is God except the Lord, and who is a rock except our God? As David's writing about this, he's thinking probably a little bit different than what we would think about. David's probably thinking about the concept of God compared to idolatry. Right? We don't really see any people that build or make statues and they worship those statues. We don't really see that happening today. But in David's time, right, people did build statues to false gods and worshipped idolatry. Well, David's statement there in verse 32 is, look, you can put all the idols together in one room. You can take all the gods from any of the other religions and put them in one room. None of them are going to compare to the majesty and the power of the God that David served. Who is God except the Lord? Who is a rock except our God? There is no one that can compare to the God that David serves. Hence, why David turned to God when things were troublesome in his life. There was no one better to help David out than God. Notice that he also says again that God is my strength and my power. He makes my way perfect. Things that we kind of touched on earlier. Notice verse 34, He makes my feet like the feet of deer. Certainly you think about what's being portrayed there is the idea of swiftness. Again, that could connect to the fact about David's military success. A quick-moving army. A lot of times that that could be sort of tied into having a powerful army. You know, if feet move quickly, maybe you're conquering a lot of land. You know, it also could connect to the idea of perhaps David being able to resist temptation. He makes my feet like the feet of deer. And I'm thinking about this maybe in a spiritual sense too, but there are times where we as Christians are to run away from things. All right, James chapter 4, James told the Christians there to resist the devil. Other passages in the Bible talk about fleeing from temptation. And of course, in those situations, there are times where you do have to run, much like Joseph ran from Potiphar's wife, ran out of a situation in which he could have been tempted and committed sin. And in that situation, Joseph knew what God's word said, or at least prioritized God's word, and so he fled from that situation as quickly as he could. Sometimes we have to flee as well in order to remove ourselves from temptation. Now, that could be true for David. Certainly we think about in verse 34, we also probably think about David being on the run in various parts of his life, where he was on the run from Saul, where he had to go and live in other nations for a while. In all of those situations, David was on the move, but again, the idea is that God was there to help him even when he was on the run. And then verse 35, He teaches my hands to make war, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Certainly there you're thinking about David's military power again, right? David has been successful militarily because of God's help. You know, whereas and you can kind of compare this to the reaction in 1 Samuel 18, following David killing Goliath, where David, again, where the people of Israel are singing David's praises. Right, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. In all of that, remember that Saul got jealous because of David, but David essentially was of the mindset that, again, I am not successful if God had not helped me. As he told Goliath, right, I'm not going to deliver you. It's going to be the Lord that delivers you into my hand. Because David trusted in God to be successful. And again, that builds on a spiritual thing that we've already seen in this chapter. That in life, sometimes the best thing that we can do is that when we are successful, to make sure that God gets the credit for it. Not just in how we publicly demonstrate that, but also in how we do this privately. No doubt, while this song is obviously probably sung in a public setting, David's probably writing this song on his own. And it shows in a way, at least privately, David giving credit to God for his success. Now notice verses 36, and really these are all, we'll go ahead and read down through verse 43. Again, a lot of this is the same idea that David is getting at, right? This is a song of victory. Verse 36, you have also given me the shield of your salvation. Your gentleness has made me great. You enlarged my path under me, so my feet did not slip. I have pursued my enemies and destroyed them. Neither did I turn back again till they were destroyed. And I have destroyed them and wounded them, so that they could not rise. They have fallen under my feet. For you have armed me with strength for the battle. You have subdued under me those who rose against me. You have also given me the necks of my enemies, so that I destroyed those who hated me. They looked, but there was none to save, even to the Lord, but he did not answer them. Then I beat them as fine as the dust of the earth. I trod them like dirt in the streets, and I spread them out. Again, we've already seen the concept of the idea of the shield of salvation. It protected David. God was there to protect David in multiple parts of his life. Notice again, though, that your gentleness has made me great. Perhaps what David's referring to here is his sort of, what we might say is his humble origins. Right? We remember the whole process of how David was selected as king. God told Samuel, look, I'm looking for an individual that is essentially different from Saul. I'm looking for a man that's after my own heart, which Saul was not. And remember that Samuel went to the house of Jesse, and he goes through and looks at every single one of Jesse's sons until they have to call in David from the field for Samuel to anoint David as king, because that's who God wanted. Right? David did not come from a house of royalty. He was not even the most preeminent son within his own family. And yet, God, at least in this sense, God's gentleness has made me great, pulling David from a humble status and putting him in a position of leadership in Israel. Certainly, as we think about this, we think about Jesus as well. Jesus, of course, being born into a poor family, being born in the city of Bethlehem, a city that was not very well known. Grew up in the city of Nazareth, right? Remember that in John chapter 1, some of the disciples wondered, could any good thing come out of Nazareth? Well, Jesus did. Jesus, who died on the cross. Again, a very shameful death at the time, a death of the criminal, and yet we know that at the end of all that, because of God's working, Jesus is now sitting on the right hand of the throne of God. Think about that in perspective of the church. Very small in Acts chapter 2. You think about that from the perspective of the people in the church. Paul would say in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 that the individuals that were called, at least within that congregation, he noted that many of them were not noble. They were not wealthy. They were not powerful. And that held up true with a lot of the secular records that we do have of the early church that point to the fact that probably most Christians were not very wealthy. The ones that were probably the exception, and yet at the same time, they're called into God's kingdom. As we think about it at the end of the book of Revelation, right, those Christians that suffered in life, who were sort of at the lower end of the totem pole in society, will one day dwell in a city where there is no sorrow, where there is no need for light and no need for physical sustenance anymore, because, again, at least in a spiritual sense, God's provided all that. So God's gentleness has made me great. Think about it in that perspective, being able to take something of a small status and making it into a great name. He did that for David. He did that with Jesus, and certainly He will do that with us if we are faithful to Him. Notice verse 37, you enlarged my path under me so that my feet did not slip. This might in some ways remind us of what he said in verses 5 and 6, where David is basically portraying the amount of the onslaught of his enemies, and you almost have the picture of David being backed into a corner where he has very little room to move around, where he has very little room to breathe. And that kind of connects to verse 37. God comes along and David says, you enlarged my path under me so that my feet did not slip. Right? I did not run out of room. I wasn't overcome by my enemies. I had the ability to escape and in a way get more breathing room. I know a lot of times we think about, if you think about temptation, a lot of times it feels that way sometimes, that, the more that you try to do right, it seems the harder it becomes, because, in some ways it seems as though the devil's sort of working overtime, trying to get us to stumble. And that is a very sobering feeling, because a lot of times with temptation it feels very overwhelming. It makes us feel as though there's no breathing room. It makes us feel that there's no way out. And yet, I believe Wayne mentioned this in his lesson maybe a couple weeks ago. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that there's no temptation which is given to man that we cannot overcome, because God provides a way of escape. Spiritually, we might feel like David in verses 5 and 6, but spiritually we also know that in verse 37 that God can help us overcome that temptation, give us breathing room, so to speak. And then verses 38 through 43, you have the picture here of David, and again, continuing to deal with his enemies, right? I pursued my enemies and destroyed them. Neither did I turn back again until they were destroyed. That could be a reference back to the Amalekites, back in 1 Samuel chapter 30, where David was continuing to pursue after them. And David was in the process of trying to wipe them all out, which we remember Saul failed to do that back in 1 Samuel 15. Well, David fulfilled and was successful in doing that for the most part. He didn't have any hesitation serving God, is the idea. I destroyed them and wounded them. They could not rise. They have fallen under my feet. That could deal with a number of David's enemies. Certainly, you think about Saul. He's removed from the picture. The other opponents in David's life, Goliath, they'd all been removed from the picture. And again, verses 40 and 41, David's right there making sure that God gets the credit for it. I will point out verses 42 and 43. Notice that they looked, but there was none to save. So obviously, the other nations, when they tried to turn to idolatry, that didn't preserve them. But even those that tried to turn to God, notice that He did not answer them. Remember that was the case for Saul, right? When God rejects Saul, he selected David. He selected David as the next king of Israel. Remember that Saul was very frantic by that, right? He tried to turn to the priest I believe they could not get an answer. Remember that Saul then decides that he's going to go visit this woman in the city of Endor, who, again, practiced witchcraft, which, again, the law of Moses stated that was a sin that was punishable by death because it was connected to idolatry. And remember that Saul's last resort was when he did not hear from God, which could be a reference to what is being said here in verses 42. When Saul turned to the Lord and God did not answer him, Saul turned to idolatry for help. But the ultimate result is verse 43, that I beat them as fine as the dust of the earth. I trod them like dirt in the streets, and I spread them out. Now, while David, of course, didn't do that to Saul physically, that was the end result for Saul in really his household as well. The idea there is that they are no longer a problem for David. Jesus pointed out in Matthew chapter 5 the idea of, if we are supposed to be the salt of the earth and we lose our ability to give flavor, remember that Jesus said that the best thing the only thing we're good for now is to be thrown onto the ground and trodden under the foot of men. It's kind of the idea. It's the idea of worthlessness. Well, the enemies of David at this point are worthless because God has helped David overcome them. Verse 44, you have also delivered me from the strivings of my people. You have kept me as the head of the nations. A people I have not known shall serve me. The foreigners submit to me. As soon as they hear, they obey me. The foreigners fade away and come frightened from their hideouts. Obviously, internal struggles. We've seen that in David's life at this point. And while this song is, again, probably written before some of those struggles that we saw in 2 Samuel with, again, David and Absalom, remember that David also had, earlier struggles within his own family. Of course, when David married Saul's daughter, Michal, right? Remember that was a pretty big problem, right? Saul went and took Michal and gave her to another man. David had a lot of internal family struggles before dealing with his son Absalom. And naturally, when you have two people competing as king, people take sides, right? The house of Saul and really the tribe of Benjamin, for the longest part, were supporters of the house of Saul. They weren't necessarily happy at first that David had become king, and yet David did become king. Not just king over some of Israel, but became king over all of Israel, right? Benjamin and the house of Saul eventually did submit to David's leadership. In addition to that, again, not just the people of Israel, but the other nations. That's verses 45 and 46. They had submitted to David because of David's success. We might point out here that it was by the end of David's reign as king that Israel was at its largest size. It had expanded at least to its largest point because David had been successful in dealing with Israel's foreign enemies. Then verses 47 through 51, David concludes, the Lord lives, blessed be my rock. Let God be exalted, the rock of my salvation. It is God who avenges me and subdues the people under me. He delivers me from my enemies. You also lift me up above those who rise against me. You have delivered me from the violent man. Therefore I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the Gentiles, and sing praises to your name. He is the tower of salvation to his king, and shows mercy to his anointed, to David and his descendants forevermore. And that final conclusion, again, if there's any, and we think about this final conclusion to the song, a lot of times the concluding part is to remind the reader, or in this case to remind the person singing the song, what's the ultimate point. David's ultimate point is it's only God who can deliver. At the end of the day, the Lord lives. I know that he lives because, at least physically for David, of how he's been delivered. Now, of course, for us, spiritually speaking, we know that the Lord lives because of how we have been delivered from sin through the blood of Christ. It is God who avenges me and subdues the people under me. There's no doubt about that. He delivered me from my enemies. You have lifted me up above those who rise against me. You have delivered me from the violent man. That's why, verse 50, I will give thanks to you, O Lord. But now notice that he specifies here, among the Gentiles. Now that may not seem like a very important very important clarification, but it actually is. Remember that part of the reason why God chose the nation of Israel, why he brought them out of the land of Egypt and let them settle into the land of Canaan, was not just for their benefit, but was also to basically be a light to the world about what God expects when it comes to the idea of righteousness. That's what Israel's job was supposed to do. Your job is to reflect God's will to the foreign nations. And that, again, was one of the reasons why God did help David subdue other nations, not out of cruelty, but in reality to try to help bring them into, and really to help them proselytize to Judaism, right? To do what God said. Remember that Paul would later on in Romans chapter 2, when he's talking about why the church and really why God now accepts Christians as his people rather than the Jews, one of the reasons that Paul emphasized that is because the Jews had failed, at least the people of Israel had failed to be the light to the Gentiles. I believe it's Romans chapter 2 where he specifically said that because of the wickedness of Israel, they had blasphemed the name of God among the other nations. They had failed to do that. But David in his life recognized that part of the responsibility of Israel and his role as king was to sing your praises not to the people in his own country, but to sing the praises of God to the Gentiles. And that carries the idea of being faithful. And so then verse 51, he is the tower of salvation to his king. He shows mercy to his anointed, to David and his descendants forevermore. And as you think about verse 51, no doubt, you probably should, and in my mind, naturally, you think about Jesus as well. That he shows mercy to his anointed. Right? We know that the term Messiah, the Christ, means anointed. It means that this is somebody that God has selected. God selected David. Naturally, of course, he selected his son. And Jesus took on that role to be the salvation for mankind, to David and his descendants forevermore. And naturally, as we read that, we certainly think about not just David, but David's descendants, not just his kids, but also thinking about later on Jesus as well. With that being said, are there any other comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about this morning?
I see all this just complete and utter dependence, much like when a baby is born into the world. It's completely dependent on mom and dad. And the same with David here. Again, as you said, all the credit goes to God, and you see in his life that he relied on the Lord. The praise goes to God because he knew that God was behind him. Well, that's true for all of us. At the end of the day, when it's all said and done, we too, if we're going to be saved, we are dependent on God. We have a part to play, obviously, but we are dependent on God in salvation.
Absolutely, and that, of course, requires great humility, which, again, we saw in earlier parts of David's life when he was, willing to repent. And in this case here, give credit to God for the positive things that had happened in David's life. All right, we're out of time. We're going to go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up in chapter 23 next week. We've got 2 chapters to cover. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention.